Buonasera a tutti e grazie di essere con noi stasera. Abbiamo il piacere di avere qui con noi la dottoressa Bettina Bader. Quindi cambio giusto la lingua con il mio terribile inglese per introdurvi la relatrice di stasera. I'm very grateful and honored to be able to introduce you Dr. Bettina Bader, who this evening she'll speaking about objective identities, how Egyptian is Egyptian material culture. Bettina Bader is head of research group archaeology in Egypt and Sudan in Department of Prehistory and Western Asian and Northeast African Archaeology for the Austrian Academy of Science. She studied at Vienna, at the University of Vienna. She achieved her MA and her PhD and several postdoc positions. Her Marie Curie project was conducted at the McDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, and she was also the principal investigator of the project Foreigners in Ancient Egypt, and she was also assistant professor at the Institute of Egyptology at the University of Vienna, so we have a long biography. Since 2015, she was the principal investigator of the START project, Beyond Politics, Material Culture of the Second Intermediate Period Egypt and Nubia, and she was head of research group Material Culture in Egypt and Nubia. But the Dr. Bettina Bader is a great archaeologist. She works everywhere in Egypt because she had 25 years experience in archaeological excavation in Egypt. She worked in Tel El Dabba with the Austrian Archaeological Institute, in Memphis with the Egyptian Exploration Society, in Dashur, in Heraclopolis Magna, in Deir el-Besha, Lisht, Thebes, Elephantine, Deir el-Ballas, so everywhere. And in 2019, she obtained her habilitation of the University of Vienna with the thesis Complexity of Identity Research in Archaeology, Interpretational Possibility by Means of the Case Study of the Late Middle Kingdom Settlement. And her talk this night will raise awareness on somewhat hidden prejudice and preconceived idea about the identities of ancient people based on material culture in various forms. But I don't want to take away any more time, and so I would like to finish my presentation with a quote of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. One single version of the story create a stereotype. And the problem with stereotype is not they are false, but they are incomplete. They turn a story into a single story. So I leave Dr. Bettina Bader, and I thank you to be here tonight.
Thank you for this very kind introduction. And I shall try to start. All'inizio vorrei ringraziare per l'invito da parte del museo e amici del museo. Questo è un privilegio per me. Sfortunatamente la mia abilità di parlare italiano non è abbastanza per questa conferenza. For this reason, I would like to continue in English, but I hope that the essence will be understandable. First, I would like to give you an overview of the contents of the lecture, starting with a few definitions, namely, what do we mean when we talk about material culture, identity, or rather a considerable number of identities, the connection between material culture and identities, as well as what is meant when we talk about Egyptian, Nubian, or Asiatic, with a view to people who are long dead and cannot be interviewed today about how they would describe themselves, who they were, and which language they spoke. I would like to raise awareness that historical reconstruction of the past is more influenced by the present than is generally obvious, and that thoughts and feelings that are entirely normal for us today may not have had any bearing or importance for people in the past. Nevertheless, the search for knowledge about the past helps us to understand the present. To say a little about my motivation to give this talk, I should mention that I work with particular bits of material culture, namely most of the time with pottery, but also other things. Frequently, this particular specialization is conceived as an end to itself, but because pottery, in those times I engage with, is made by hand and not in a mass production, a lot of information beyond mere dating can be gained. It takes time to make a pot, and it takes time to think and write about it. It is also the case that usually a selection of pots from a site does not tell the whole story. Moreover, there are other finds as well, and the overall assemblage provides the fullest possible picture. Of course, there could always be more, but the sources we have should be used to the fullest extent. It may seem strange to get from pottery to identities, but starting to work at a site where individuals lived supposedly from different cultural backgrounds, inevitably one ends up having to think about what exactly it is that differentiates them from each other, if we are able to do this at all by means of archaeology. And I can say already it is not straightforward and easy, and we just have to let go of some ideas that are modern. The identity of people in the past, namely the essence of who they are and how they view themselves, has been in the focus of research and also within archaeological theory for a considerable period now. The questions being asked of the past have changed. Not only do we want to know what happened in this or the other year, but also what was the situation of women, for example, or children. Not so long ago, history was researched mostly by male white people, and the viewpoint of the researcher also has a direct impact on the subject being researched, namely what sorts of questions are being asked and what is considered as interesting. Thus, the greater diversity of researchers also led to a greater variety of viewpoints, and that makes piecing together information about the past much more diverse and relevant. The research on identities in the present also opened up numerous research avenues concerning individuals in the past, although obtaining information is much more complicated because we have only indirect evidence to reconstruct their lives, such as material culture they used and texts they wrote, or pictures they made in ancient times. Crucially, we cannot ask them, why did you use this vessel and not that for cooking, lentils, for example? Or why did you write that letter with those words and not others? Moreover, the puzzle emerging is never complete, and usually there are more possibilities than one to interpret any given find. Identity represents the grand total of influences and aspects that shape our personhood and make individual people who they are, how they see themselves and how they are seen by others. In other words, a multitude of relationships between the individual, their social environment, their family, their congregation, their workplace, and so on. Whilst much research was directed towards ethnicity, it is now considered only one aspect, even if conceived as a prominent one in our modern world. There is a multitude of single components, a few of them are on this slide. Also, there are very individual for each person. There are aspects directly connected to the person, like sex and age. On the one hand, they are relatively unchangeable, like sex, but on the other hand, very much in flux, like age. Advancing age inevitably changes the viewpoints and perspectives, and thus this aspect of identity of a person. Beside these inherent parts of identity, there are other, more external aspects that shape the identity, such as status, gender, religion, cultural background, as well as language, profession, and individual life experiences, such as prolonged stays in another country, for example, for work. The fluid and multi-layered quality of the social concept of identity has the great advantage over, for example, the primordial view of ethnicity that there are more possibilities than just to belong to a certain group or not. Even for modern people who can be asked, an answer is not always straightforward. Identity can be more ambiguous. A person might have grown up in one area and then moved somewhere else and adapted to another lifestyle in a different social group, at least in part. Both aspects would be part of their identities, which need not to exclude one another and may be present in the material culture the person uses and produces in indirect ways, and also depend highly in which actual situation a person is, in particular moments in time. If you move to a new city or a new country, you may make a clean slate and reinvent yourself according to your own wishes. Nobody is any the wiser. To sum it up, one does not have a single identity, but one constructs several, consciously and unconsciously. There are two ways of seeing identity from a theoretical viewpoint: as primordialist or essentialist concept that is fixed by birth and unchangeable and quite unified, and the instrumentalist concept that is open to manipulation by the people themselves and groups and in different situations. While the essentialist approach was identified as more or less veiled racism, the second is of course much more complicated to research, especially of people who are long dead. Perhaps in a quiet minute you may think about yourself and some personal aspects which may have changed in your life over time in order to experience and explore some of your own identities. Following the instrumentalist view, groups of people may also form individual identities which are specific for them, but are not based on biological criteria such as common descent or common DNA. A condition to form a group is that the boundaries that divide one group from another are mutual and permeable, and that group members are recognized by the other group members as well as by outsiders. The construction of the group identity may even be derived from common experiences as a group of people that neither have to originate from one country, speak the same language, or have to be from the same family. It may appear trivial to try and explain who is actually Egyptian or Asiatic or Nubian, because obviously there are people living in these countries. And this is where a problem in definition starts. What we call Egypt today is not necessarily 100% the same as in the past. Moreover, the people living in that area did probably conceive differently about the country they lived in. Because unlike today, nobody had a passport or a nationality, as we do only since the 19th century AD. So how did people identify themselves? It seems in part through their names and in part through their spoken language, as we know from texts and by depictions on stelae from tombs and other monuments. Texts suggest that as soon as a person spoke ancient Egyptian, they were considered Egyptian. A quite fluid concept then, as we saw before, that does not have to mean a person needed to be born on Egyptian soil or to Egyptian parents to be Egyptian. A look on the map without borders shows the natural geography, and many of our modern borders go through areas that naturally belong together. If we move on to Asiatics who lived in what is today the Levant and Syria-Palestine, it is well understandable that the ancient Egyptian terminology with A'amu remains rather vague, and it is not easy to know where exactly the areas known from the past were located. Usually, people depicted with darker skin are addressed as Nubians and sometimes identified by accompanying texts. But within that group, more diversity is to be found for sure. Of course, there there are the stereotypes, as we heard before, which are often used especially when it comes to situations in which power relations are in the focus of attention, when, for example, the pharaoh has to show that he is in charge. The smiting of the enemies is a particular example. This icon is used since time immemorial, and it also cemented our modern view of the inhabitants of Setsu and Kash, Wawat and Rechenu, which was heavily influenced by colonialism. One could almost compare this ancient Egyptian ideology to the culture-historical view we know today. To talk about Egyptian history necessitates to mention the variety of sources at our disposal. There are written texts, various pictorial sources, sometimes with labels, and ever increasingly a lot of archaeology and material culture. In Egypt, I do not want to go into detail here, but it has to be said that each of those sources needs a specific approach and critique to interpretation, and much of the time, interpretations vary considerably between different schools of thought, even considering the same sources. This brings me to the culture-historical approach to much of history and archaeology that differs strongly from the post-colonial approach derived from social sciences and social anthropology. I will come back to that a bit later. Since the so-called material turn, material culture, or more encompassing materiality, consists of everything that surrounds us, from the sandals that we wear to the house in which we live. In studying material culture, the haptic quality of physically engaging with the study subject cannot be overestimated. The objects are no longer considered as mere illustration of what the ancient Egyptians used, but they tell more individual stories of their owners and their lives, how they made and used and discarded things. I would now like to come to various conceptual models of what culture is, even though this slide might look a bit confusing at first. One factor decisive in reconstructing the past is the way culture, which I like to call the way of doing things, is conceptualized. Since the German philosopher Herder, culture was seen as invariable and with fixed boundaries, and this concept is at the basis of the culture-historical paradigm, which connects a set of cultural features with certain historical artifacts and traditions. For example, think of the specific way ancient Egyptians are depicted in wall paintings. A paradigmatic change from culture as a pure and unchangeable construct like a billiard ball that bounces off the other at the top to an open concept of culture is necessary. It is able to creatively integrate various influences, and the concept is shown at the bottom. This opens new horizons of thinking, and such concepts derive mostly from post-colonial studies. Often, existing culture-historical concepts were questioned in colonial situations where multiple traditions, languages, and cultures met, and an intricate mix of a multitude of influences and nuances formed sometimes under suppression and asymmetrical power relations. This is in crass contrast to the tendency to order people according to their identity into neatly divided and often binary groups. As soon as we let go of this self-imposed need, more opportunities of looking at people and their past open up. This conceptualization of culture led to several models of how to think about contacts between a variety of actors, as we find it, for example, in colonial situations in which European empires were the ruling and suppressing powers, or in borderland situations. In this field, sources available are often textual, and in modern studies, people can be interviewed how they would identify themselves. For Egyptian archaeology, such an opportunity is usually not available. One of the problems with such bounded concepts is that there is no consensus on how to define them, so that over time they mean almost everything. and one of these, for example, is acculturation. As a bounded cultural concept, it seems unsuitable because one cultural trait seems to win over the other and then suppresses it. My observations fit more to situations like appropriation, third space, and entanglement, which represent more the existence of several traits that are used in a creative mix, without one suppressing the other necessarily. Other concepts, such as hybridity, are either derived from colonial situations or they represent biological metaphors which are not really suitable because material culture is a product of human creativity and not interbreeding. The basis for thinking about human behavior as seen in archaeology is the way in which material culture and human behavior are actually connected. So to say, the link between artifacts and human behavior. Many archaeologists follow the ideas of Pierre Bourdieu, who maintained that structurer and structuring elements have mutual relationships, some of which are unconscious and impress elements of identities on artifacts. One simple example for that is the fact that most of us grew up in rectangular houses and therefore prefer to live and build rectangular houses as life continues. The experience of growing up in a rectangular house influences all our choices in our further lives, including how our furniture should look like. Imagine we had grown up in round houses and how that would change our view on how to live. Now is the time to briefly talk about our understanding of Egyptian culture, and I show you here a few iconic sculptures and objects that would be immediately identified as Egyptian. But what does that mean? That Egyptians made them? That all people living in the past in the area of modern Egypt were all of the same descent? That they were homogeneous? That they all acted in the same way? It is part of normative, that is, culture historical theory, to expect that all people do everything in the same way. But archaeology shows that this is actually not the case. Deviations are visible, for example, in one contemporary cemetery anywhere in Egypt. There is always a range of behaviors regarding what was put into the burial as grave goods, the way the body was laid out, and so on. Thus, in embracing variation, it is possible to gain a denser picture of people and their past. When I say Egyptian or Syro-Palestinian in this lecture, I'm talking more about modern geography than culture. Now I would like to turn to archaeology and present a few aspects of identities in a late Middle Kingdom settlement at Tel el-Dabra Arboris in the period of circa 1800 to 1700 BC in the northeastern Nile Delta, as it is marked in this map. The site is located in the geographical border zone between Egypt and southern Palestine and also quite close to Cyprus. The position alone may have led to the development as a trade hub, which is corroborated by finds of imported storage containers from the Levant, as well as Cypriot and Minoan pottery. It could be considered as liminal area with manifold connections over land as well as over sea at a meeting point between Northeast Africa and Western Asia and social groups living there. The Geophysical Survey conducted over the last decades shows the immense expanse of the site in space. It has been excavated in several areas since the 1960s by the Austrian Archaeological Institute, first under the direction of Manfred Bietak and now under Irene Forstner-Müller. The chronological scope is also very wide, from the early Middle Kingdom to the late period, that is approximately equivalent to 2000 to 664 BC in some places. I will concentrate only on a very small part of the exposure and temporal scope because it is relevant for the topic. It is important to remember that from one excavated area we cannot automatically assume that all the others are the same, as we learned during the analysis of all the finds. We have to look carefully each time. It gives me pleasure to talk about the settlement here because in Egyptian archaeology, settlement projects only slowly increase, although it is so important to consider a counterbalance to the much more prominent features of afterlife in Egypt. This chronological chart gives you an idea which part of Egyptian history is being discussed. The settlement belongs to the end of the Middle Kingdom, during which a strong central administration is known, with a high number of important offices and their holders being known especially for the 12th dynasty. The phase I'm talking about is almost at the end of the Middle Kingdom, probably equivalent to the first part of the 13th dynasty, just before administrative centralization seems to deteriorate and a number of areas in ancient Egypt start to drift more apart in terms of development of administration and even material culture. This settlement area is also 2 archaeological phases earlier than the 15th dynasty and the so-called foreign rule over parts of Egypt. So there are no Hyksos in this settlement because these kings only appear later, approximately 50 to 70 years. This is the area where the excavation of the 1960s to 80s took place, and the most obvious thing is that on the surface not very much is to be seen. As you remember the Geophysical Survey from before. Excavating in the delta is very hard work, and although mud brick in mud is visible, it takes quite a long time to excavate and record it. Here is an overall plan where all the areas dating to the late Middle Kingdom are marked. It is interesting to note that in this phase no temples or other sacred buildings were uncovered, and neither a city wall, although the area is quite large. That does not mean that they could not have existed, but they would have had to be located in another place. In the top right corner, the temple of the earlier 12th dynasty had already fallen out of use at the time of the settlement. I'm going to talk about more. It has become clear that the other 2 areas differ in terms of architecture and the number and distribution of tombs, and also the combination of artifacts in the assemblages. This is a result which was rather unexpected, but in the following I will only talk about area A2 in the green circle. First, I should make it clear that only a very small fraction of the finds at the site contained written evidence, such as a few names. The settlement I'm presenting here did not provide a single textual source of any kind. So there is the architecture with houses and a few tombs. Objects found include a majority of pottery, some chipped stone tools, other stone tools such as cairns, rubbing stones, hammerstones, mortars, and pallets. Biological remains include the human remains from the tombs, animal bones from burial goods, animal bones from settlement refuse, and archaeobotanic remains when they were charred. Not preserved due to the wet soil conditions are organic materials, finds of unfired clay, written sources, and pictorial sources. Thus, only a part of the overall repertoire of material culture is available for the contextual interpretation. We do not exactly know what is missing from the record, and so the absence of artifacts does also not prove that they did not exist. We simply have no information and need to acknowledge that. The ground plan of Phase G provides an idea of the spatial arrangement of the settlement. Unlike other known Egyptian settlements, this one appears self-organized and developed in a natural way. The house units often consist of a central unit with one wide and one narrow room, and then sometimes other single rooms attached. The preservation of this architecture was not very good because the settlement was not destroyed in one action, but just used continuously. This gradually destroyed the older layers as they were overbuilt. The archival photos show the situation during the excavation. And here we see the remains of a silo, a fireplace, the room of a house, and another fireplace. The basic ground plan of the houses is identical to the ancient Egyptian hieroglyph winding wall. A similar unit has been published from an enclosure of Hor-Aha in the First Dynasty at Abydos. Unfortunately, the position of the doors could not be recovered. Comprehensive research about this architectural unit in Egypt and Syria-Palestine yielded only parallels in settlements in the Egyptian Nile Valley. Syria-Palestine of the Middle Bronze Age and earlier did not provide comparanda for non-urban settlement patterns, and those in dense urban centers show completely different layouts. Thus, a comparison is still difficult and cannot be entirely finalized. The wooden house models, usually found as burial gifts of the earlier Middle Kingdom, provide a three-dimensional impression how our houses might have looked like, at least in terms of room division. While it would be risky to take an idealized model too literally, it gives some insight into the actual idea of what a house needs to include to be considered fit for eternity. It might be regarded like metadata. Very few architectural elements were made of stone in the delta, where stone is naturally rare and needs to be transported there. There was one column base in the largest house of the settlement and a few limestone door sockets to provide a good footing for a wooden door. Also quite rare finds from stone, such as common rubbing and hammer stones, cairns, chipped stone tools, and possible loom weights or tethering stones. These stone artifacts are particularly interesting as they were all made of siltstone, which had to be brought in from the Nile Valley. Some of them suggest activities to do with weighing, others are higher prestige items such as pallets and stone vessels. These items were not found in situ, but mostly in contexts containing disused materials and rubbish. This makes it difficult to interpret these items. By far the largest group of finds was pottery, and I do not want to go into detail here, just to convey the basic facts. In settlements, the pottery is almost always completely broken, as you can see here on this as a typical example. However, enough comparable material exists to classify it and to obtain an idea what it was used for. So there is tableware to eat and drink, storage vessels, cooking vessels, and imported vessels from the Nile Valley on the one hand and from the Levant on the other, and they contain some commodity, probably grain, wine, or oil. Here I collected together some of the more complete examples of the typical vessels from before, but that was a rare occurrence because the settlement was not left suddenly at any point, but the usable things were continued to be used and only the broken stuff was discarded. From these vessels, it is possible to tell that the settlement was used some time at the end of the Middle Kingdom. I would like to linger a little bit on the cooking pottery because in quite a few case studies on identity, the way people eat and cook and with what provides an insight into some aspects of their identities, because the way people eat and cook is very conservative and tends not to change. So let us see how this can be interpreted. Cooking pottery constitutes about 20% of the overall ceramic finds. Most of them look like this, a restricted bowl with a folded rim and a round base. They were typically made from a very sandy fabric and often are blackened by use. A tradition with similar forms and clay raw materials can be traced back in the Nile Valley even to the late Old Kingdom, hundreds of years before. So these pots do not suddenly appear out of the blue, and moreover, they are also found in other places in the Nile Valley. It is true, however, that vessels of a similar shape were found in Syria-Palestine, but there is not much evidence that those vessels were also used for cooking, because usually they are not described as blackened. A small portion of cooking pottery shows the same characteristics, a quite rough raw material and blackening, but a completely different shape. At first, these vessels were imported from the Levant, but soon after we find local products which are slightly different. Please keep this in mind. I will come back to that a little bit later. Finally, there are also imported vessels, as said before, mostly transport amphorae to import wine or oils, and some small jugs for more precious contents. Some of the fragments you see here, but they are always quite rare. Another feature is the local production of certain vessel forms that are not represented in the local repertoire of the site, apart from the imports, like those dipper chocolate fragments on the right. Now I would like to proceed to the tombs in the settlement of Tel El Dabra, which is a truly remarkable fact. Although it is not the usual custom in the Nile Valley, there are exceptions, and children are often buried in settlements also there. In the Levant, however, tombs of people in all age groups are located in settlements regularly. Considering the topography of the delta, where the desert and mountains are not close, the reason for this difference could be a lack of desert edge and not only immigration of non-Egyptian people. Problematic is the limited number of contemporary settlement projects to get a better idea of local customs in the delta. I show the settlement plan again, this time with the contemporary tombs also marked. In contrast to other parts of the settlement, this area has very few tombs, only 8 compared to 90 in roughly the same area, and also less tombs with traditions known from Syria-Palestine. Evidence for non-Egyptian burial customs were found in earlier phases and in other areas, where, for example, the famous statue of in Egyptian style with mushroom hairstyle representing a non-Egyptian was found, as well as a scarab with the name of Sobergemhat, whose title was Prince of Retinue, or ruler of the foreign lands. Those items certainly provide evidence for contact or even presence of singular non-Egyptian people from Syria-Palestine in those other phases and areas. But does that mean that all inhabitants were Syro-Palestinian, even in a later phase and in a different area? This chamber tomb was built for 3 individuals, 1 male, 1 female, and a child. The burial goods derive from both the Egyptian and Levantine cultural spheres, which have not merged at this point, but items of both spheres are used together. Some recently published isotope analyses were conducted, suggesting some of the individuals grew up outside the delta. It could not be determined yet if this means the Levant or the Nile Valley. Interestingly, the grave goods of the woman in the pit follow the Egyptian cultural tradition, except for some imported pottery, which does not show the origin of a person, but rather the social standing in having imported and therefore more expensive materials. Another tomb contained a woman in a limestone sarcophagus with objects in Egyptian tradition extended supine. Mummification cannot be proven due to the bad preservation of organic materials in the delta. Isotope data are not available for this individual. Further burials contain an extended supine woman with a scarab, a child without burial gifts, and 2 flexed women on their backs, one with an Egyptian kochel pot, the other with Egyptian pottery and a pin that was not well enough preserved for recording. Again, some results of isotope analysis suggest that 2 women grew up in the delta and 1 outside of it. Interestingly, there is no congruence of growing up location and the burial customs in terms of burial position or types of objects. I would now like to sum up our knowledge about who lived in this settlement in Area A2, and what I would like to stress is that the other areas need to be considered separately, and nothing should be extrapolated from one area to the other. Only then it is possible to observe some objectivity concerning the identities of the people who spent their lives in these places and shared their various spheres of life with each other, and therefore certainly influenced each other. The settlement yields imported ceramics as evidence for considerable commodity exchange. The presence of the Syro-Palestinian cooking pot type suggests knowledge of culinary habits prevalent in that area. Whether persons with first-hand knowledge were present or not is not clear. The local copies of previously imported material might also hint at presence of first-hand knowledge, but again, there are some arguments against such a proposition. The tombs allow most insight into the individual identities present, although the evidence on their ethnic identity in this part of the settlement is also ambiguous. The presence of the tomb in the settlement has been used as evidence for Syro-Palestinian derivation of the inhabitants. But it is also true that we do not know which traditions were generally derived from the delta, where no desert edge is available for burial, as in the Nile Valley. The overwhelming impression is of an intricate mix of traditions occurring in this site in the liminal borderland between Egypt and Syria-Palestine. We can state the presence of children and women in ages from young adult to late adult and possibly mature. Notably, there is only one man buried in this area. The social status is very likely differentiated considering the nature of burial gifts and tombs. The same can be said from the evidence of the settlement, as the sizes of the houses differ as well. Finds from the settlement point to limited activity in agriculture and hunting, as well as functions in the framework of commodity exchange. Evidence for religious beliefs are confined to amulets derived from the Egyptian belief system and a possible cult installation without contemporary parallels in neither Egypt nor Syria-Palestine. And here I show briefly a plan and some photos of this unparalleled installation, which has been interpreted as cultic. Now there are two models available for interpreting the archaeological record of this area in phase G. The traditional culture-historical model that is in use since many decades, stating that very well acculturated immigrants from Syria-Palestine were settled by the Egyptian authorities in the northeastern Nile Delta, which adhered to only a few of their native traditions, mostly expressed in the burials. Those burials in Area A2 are scarcer than in other contemporary areas, and they use traits known from both Egypt and Syria-Palestine. The second, more heretic possibility under the culture-historical paradigm is that Egyptians living in those borderlands themselves acquired some cultural traditions from various contacts to abroad, and it is needless to say that this view does not stand a chance of being accepted anywhere. The open and permeable culture concept, in contrast, allows the reconstruction of a social group in the northeastern delta using cultural traditions from Egypt and Syria-Palestine in a local cultural system eclectically, self-determined, and creatively representing their own local way of doing things. Whether we would like to call the model entanglement, appropriation, or third space is, in my view, not so important as the acknowledgement that there needs to be a space given to the creative ability of the members of this social group without it being categorized as assimilated Egyptian or acculturated Syro-Palestinian, which does this community and its creative potential no justice. With such an open model, it is possible to acknowledge that members of the borderland community at Teledabo lived in a milieu of entangled cultural traditions from which they, or rather their descendants who buried them, freely chose those which they thought were right for them, and it matters less whether an individual came originally from Egypt or the Levant, but that their lives were shared, at least in some aspects of daily life and their death. Grazie tante per l'attenzione.
Thank you very much for your talk. Change our mind in order to see material culture and the interpretation of archaeological data. And there is some question for the public. Yes.
Thank you so much. It was incredibly interesting also to see how you could use two different patterns of interpretation to judge how a settlement developed, whether we should stick to saying, well, there are Syro-Palestine or Egyptian, or there is the entangledness. I have a question though, because I found a very, very interesting pattern of interpretation. I have a question though, well, concerning, well, the last slide you showed, and concerning how funerary tradition can be so conservative. You said during your lecture, of course, foodways are conservative, but funerary tradition are also very conservative. And while you were talking, I was also thinking of the wonderful book Wretched Kush and the work that has been done in Askut, both on foodways and burials, to see there where there is also this entangled community of Nubian and Egyptians, and how within also the same family you could see that women, for instance, coming from Nubia would respect the funerary tradition. So if we suppose, in case of this settlement in Teledabo, that we have this entangledness of people living in this liminal space where they both get Egyptian and Syro-Palestine way of life, and they develop their own way of life. I find it very interesting to accept it. The only problem where I have some difficulty is the burial tradition and the hereafter, because we all know this is so conservative, it's so, as you said, what is identity? So I have to be very careful which word I use, but how it's so related to, let's say, family tradition, that the way you are brought up, the way that you want to repeat certain rituals in order to achieve hereafter. And so how would you define the approach to hereafter and religion in this entangled community, as it were?
Well, this last slide does really show the problem very well, because the woman in the coffin, if it was found in any other place than in the Delta, there was no doubt about her being Egyptian. But because she was found where she was found, that is the basic problem that I had. You know, we have all the texts to what the beliefs in the afterlife are, and for sure this has a bearing on this community as well, because you know. But for me, the problem started to, how do I divide them? And does it make sense to divide them? Did they divide them themselves? Because in the same settlements, there were, the mix is the thing that I needed to explain for myself a little. And when, if it's not possible to make this decision, perhaps it's not the right question.
Yes. I understand what you mean. Thank you.
That are the questions? Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you so
Bettina
much.
Vader.